If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that humans will believe almost anything. On Blasphemy with Chris and Marnee, we take a look at some of these beliefs, uncover their very human origins, how they've developed and changed over time, and the very real consequences they had in society and culture. Impacts that continue even today in our lives. So, how much do you know about RPGs? Do you know what RPG means?
RPG.
Yeah.
No.
No,
wait.
no.
Well, subject. I need some context. RPG.
So G means game.
Oh, a game?
G means game. And an RPG. Your
Oh,
sons play
role-playing.
them. There we go.
Okay.
By the way, this is Chris Setti. I'm here with
Marnee. Setti.
my perfect wife. And so, yeah, RPG stands for role-playing game.
Okay.
And role, R-O-L-E, not roll. Like it's, I know. But I mean, some
Okay.
people
Some
think
people
that's
would-
because you're rolling dice and shit like that.
Oh.
But it's not. You're
No.
playing a role.
Role-playing. Yes.
You're using your imagination
Creating
to
a
play.
character,
Exactly.
playing a role.
Exactly. And so first, though, I want to talk about the sources that I use for this, for the information I got about this particular topic that we'll cover today. So first, I used a book called Satanic Panic, Pop Cultural Paranoia in the 1980s. It's awesome, by the way. It's got like multiple authors, and they write about all the various crazy shit that went down in the 1980s around Satan trying to influence our children through heavy metal music and Saturday morning cartoons, of course, and stuff like that. And very, very specifically, the topic that we're talking about today, which is Dungeons and Dragons.
Did you read the whole book?
I've read the whole book. They're like short essays, and they're kind of self-contained, and they're about different things. And there's a lot of pictures. It's like really a fucking cool book, actually.
Yeah.
If you're like into like pop culture, it's a really cool book to have.
Yeah.
The second book I used was called Dangerous Games, What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds by a guy with the awesome name of Joseph Laycock. And he's a religious studies teacher at Texas State University with his wife.
Religious studies teacher
He's a religious...
named Laycock?
Yes, exactly. But he's not a Christian or anything.
Oh.
He teaches religious
All
studies.
religious studies. Okay.
Right. And
He's not
he did
necessarily
quite a bit.
religious.
No, he's not actually. He studies religion, and specifically around role-playing games and the moral panic in the 1980s and 90s. He studied kind of the human aspect of like just how our imaginations and the way like play and that stuff factored into role-playing games, and how that clashed with, you know, different religious and moral outlooks that were going on at times. It's a really good book. He went and talked to like, you know, interviewed a lot of people around the cases that we'll talk about. And so he's a really good source of information. We'll quote
You
him
read that whole book
quite a
too?
bit. I've read pretty much the whole book. I focused on the chapters that dealt with this time period.
Oh, okay.
And then he goes more into like more of a academic talk about how we play and how we use imagination. I didn't go so far into that, but he does talk a lot about like the history and the individual cases and what went on.
Really interesting, and I'm glad you're reading it and telling me about it, because I wouldn't want to read it.
You would never read that book?
It sounds
you
really
would not. You wouldn't.
When you say the names and what it's about and what the topics it goes into, I'm like, oh, interesting. But I just no. I've tried to read some of the books that you read for research, and I'm like, holy.
Yeah.
No.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating, but you also have to.
Like, you can wade through depths of information that would just like kill me. So I'm happy that you do that, and just tell me about it.
Well, that's kind of shit has been over 30 years now. Is like I like go out and like find out all this stuff,
Yeah.
usually meaningless, trivial
Which
things.
earbuds I should have.
Exactly, like all the
all I have to
things.
put out there is that my earbuds broke, and I know he'll know how to take care of that.
I fucking hook you up. Right. What you're saying is your life is difficult.
I'm well taken care of.
But then, and so that was, again, Dangerous Games, What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds by Joseph Laycock. And then there's this great book that I read. It's not a very long book, so it didn't take too long to get through it. A major theme that went on during the 80s and 90s during the Satanic Panic was people started teaching cops that all these kids were getting into devil worship. And so there's all these like seminars where cops could go and they showed them all these like occultic symbols and taught these cops, and they became like occult cops basically.
Oh, wow.
And so he wrote a book called this guy named Robert Hicks, and he wrote a book called In Pursuit of Satan, the Police and the Occult. And it's really, really good. And just to understand like the police, they're supposed to be like just the facts, ma'am. They're supposed to be the rational mediator that you call that looks at things from the stand. And they just got so absorbed in the occult and the idea that Satan was under every rock, and every teenager who didn't look like the little preppy kid that you saw on TV was a potential murderer or child sacrificer or something crazy like that. And the cops got really whipped up into this. Of course, just spoiler alert, the FBI, so during the 80s and 90s, huge satanic panic, people literally saying that, I mean, millions of people involved in this satanic conspiracy, minions working behind the scene, kidnapping babies, kidnapping teenage girls to like use as breeders to make babies so they could sacrifice them in their satanic rituals and things like this. This was like something, this urban legend that was taken as like, well, this is a fact that's going on. Mm-hmm. But towards the end of the 90s, the FBI actually did a huge comprehensive investigation to see, was there any truth to satanic ritual abuse and all of these ideas that were churned up in the 80s and 90s. And they came to the conclusion that none of these panned out. There was no cases that actually were real. It was all a bunch of religious moral panic that was whipped up. And it was whipped up using something that is incredibly fucked up. And that was primarily the suicides, and in some cases murder-suicides of teenagers that were going on. And they linked that to this particular role-playing game that came out in the mid-70s.
Were they just trying to find answers to those things, or...
Spoken like a mother. So, yes, when we get there, we will get there. And, of course, underneath all of this is a very human drama that's going on. There is no spiritual battle that's happening.
No, right.
Right. It's a battle of, exactly, it's pain and suffering.
But how, like, I guess, did the panic come from the mothers, like, grabbing onto it as reason, or did they use the mother's pain to... Did someone else
it was both.
Try to create something
it was both.
Using the mother's pain?
Yeah, it was both. It was kind of a kind of like the gasoline was gathered when you have these religious groups, you have like concerned mothers, you have media watchdog groups that are typically led by concerned mothers. And so all of this gas was kind of there, and then a match lit it. Yeah. And then what you had was some people entering the fray as like trying to find answers, and then some people taking advantage of those people for their agenda. Would you say
that this was the 80s and 90s, that this was in reaction to like a lot of religious right stuff happening, conservative religion resurging in the 80s and 90s after the 60s and 70s?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting time period to look at. First of all, Marnee and I were married. We've been married for almost 29 years. I was born in 1970. Marnee was born in 1971. We're 6 months apart. And so we lived through this time period.
Yeah.
And this was a very magical thinking time period. This was a time period where, I can remember growing up in the the 70s when we were little kids. And so we weren't like really that much aware of what was going on. But I do remember things like, my neighbor was this older teenager. And I remember he had one time we saw a poster that he had of Kiss, and it's like, I remember then growing up and hearing all of these people on TV and in church and all this shit talking about how Kiss was a satanic thing going on. Like Kiss stood for Knights in Satan Service, and like it was this huge deal. And
it didn't really. That was what they were saying.
Of course not. It meant
Right.
Kiss like Kiss because they were just a bunch of
They were,
horny
like,
rockers
pop-
trying to fucking get their
Yeah.
dicks wet. And so, and not only that, but like I remember like maybe 1983, I think. It was 1983. I was 13. It was like I just turned 13, so I was going into 8th grade. And I remember I had a friend who, his older brother had gotten his hand on this like bootleg tape of Metallica playing somewhere in LA. And we grew up in Los Angeles. And so like he literally, I don't know if he went there or had a friend or whatever, but he got this tape. And my friend gave it to me. And I remember going in my room and putting my headphones on so my parents couldn't hear me listening to this, because even the way he wrote Metallica on the tape was just fucking looked evil as shit. And I was so excited. And so I put my headphones on and I put this tape in and I fucking listened to this music, and it was like life changing. I'd never heard, I mean, I'd listened to like Dead Kennedys and like Suicidal Tendencies. I was kind of like a little punk skater kid. But I'd never listened to something like that aggressive and kind of at the same.
How old were you?
I just turned 13.
Okay.
And
I'm just laughing at what I was listening to.
I know. Oh, and by the way, at this time, Marnee had "I Love Chris" written on her peachy folder at
Marnee didn't know
at
Chris
school.
very well. I don't know.
Chris is listening to devil music.
Because now we're listening to Xanadu.
No, but I just remember like finishing this, and it was like they were just releasing their album Kill 'Em All. I didn't know this until much later, like what was going on at this time. I'd never heard of this group, and so it was like this crazy thing of like, oh my God, that music. It was kind of the first time music made me feel something like. And I was going through puberty. I mean, I'm a 13-year-old boy.
A lot of testosterone. It
Right.
was like connecting with
Right.
testosterone.
But what that made me do is go, I'm going to go fucking listen to Kiss. Right? Because I think if this is gnarly, first of all, it wasn't evil. If you listen to Metallica's words, they were very almost academic. It's very heady.
Yeah.
Lyrics,
No,
especially
yeah.
like for me, it was very political
Yeah.
and like socio-economic and,
Yeah.
and even like religion thrown in, but it was just quoting the Bible. They weren't like saying anything
No,
bad.
they were just telling stories.
They were telling stories, but the music seemed
music,
whatever.
yeah.
So I thought, Kiss, man, they're all like fucking dressed up, spitting blood, giant tongue, just like, this is evil shit, fire and stuff. And I fucking get I think I borrowed from my friend. He had the Kiss, like, whatever. Well, I don't even remember what album it was some popular one. And it was such bullshit, first of all. It's like, Beth, I hear you call. I'm like, what the fuck is this? And like, I want to rock and roll all night. It's
Yeah.
like my parents would enjoy listening to this
Right,
music.
right.
And they were talking about nothing but having a good time.
Yes.
There was no like, hail Satan.
Yeah.
There was nothing like that.
No.
And so it's kind of a hilarious time period because none of the things that they actually aim their ire at, they didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
And
Nothing's changed.
nothing has changed.
Because
And that's
the kind of
what's
things
important
that people
about this.
say right now, and you're like, you don't even know.
Right.
You haven't even. Oh my gosh, can you? No, stop.
Right. And it's so awesome because we look at things like witch hunts. We look at like the Salem witch trials and we think, yeah, but that happened fucking 400 years ago. That's 17th century. We were a bunch of like superstitious people who would believe anything. We didn't have all the information we have now, so we were just gullible people. But the Satanic Panic, luckily we had laws so you couldn't burn and hang
Yeah.
people.
It was the same thing.
But it was the same thing. And it was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And it's still going on today. It's just not taken seriously in the media. And we're going to see that was a huge part of it. So what we're going to do is over the next few episodes, we're going to take a look at the game Dungeons and Dragons, in relation to the Satanic Panic. And we're going to specifically talk about the main thing that lit that spark, which was it being tied to young people dying, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read you this intro, okay, to get us up to speed. In 1979, a 16-year-old college student at Michigan State University disappeared from his dorm room. The subsequent search led to steam tunnels below the campus. a place rumored to be used by students to LARP. You know what LARPing is?
That is something role playing. Live action role playing.
Live action role playing. Right. That's when we went to that wedding.
Yes.
So we went to this nerd wedding, and they the wedding party and everyone, they all had like swords on their backs,
and it was
they
like at a LARPing.
It was
place,
at a LARPing like
park,
grounds.
Like where the grounds.
It's called something keep or some crazy thing.
Yes.
So LARPing. So basically, first of all, this kid was 16 years old at Michigan State University. He entered there when he was 15. So you can always see this kid was special.
Yeah.
Okay. And he disappeared in August of 1979. And the search led to the steam tunnels so Dungeons and Dragons was first very big amongst college students, not little teenage kids yet. And so they would go out and act out these scenarios and come up with their own kind of Dungeons and Dragons-esque fantasy things. But in the steam tunnels
would be perfect.
Which would have been fucking cool as shit. I'm sorry. That sounds fun, right? Okay. But this young boy in 1979 disappeared from his dorm room at Michigan State University. And before we actually get into this case of this young man disappearing, young boy, he's not even a man. He's 16 fucking years old. And he's at a university in 1979. Okay, we live in this supportive world where like there would be resources at college to handle these little kids that kind of have made this. Back then, he was thrown into an adult world, and as we'll see, there was a lot of complicating factors going on. But first, we probably should like take a running start at where D&D came from, right?
I was going to ask that actually.
Okay, so you're going to ask like where to come from.
I was going to ask who developed it.
That's what we're going to talk about right now.
Oh.
So. Just a brief history, though. We're not going to go too deep in this because we'll go more into what happened after. So Dungeons and Dragons was created by two giant nerds, okay, named Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And when I say nerd, like today, nerd culture is all cool.
I mean, I'm wondering why you classify giant nerds.
Because this was at a time. This was at a time when these weren't the kind of nerds that we think about now.
Everyone's like,
okay,
nerds are cool.
Yeah, these were grown men who would sit in their houses painting medieval characters meticulously instead of going out and talking to women. Okay, these are people that were the origination of nerd culture, which was kind of the outcasts, the people that didn't feel like they fit in. They had different interests than the popular world, kind of expected them to. So these guys were like really, really into this stuff. Gygax was an avid medieval war games player, and he founded the International Federation of Wargaming in 1967. It provided opportunities for wargamers to exchange ideas and share the designs for games they were coming up with. The next year, Gygax hosted the first Lake Geneva War Games Convention, also known as, they call it Gen Con, in his hometown of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Thus the Gen Con, Lake Geneva. Now, it's still going on, by the way. So this was 1967, 3 years before I was born, 4 years before you were born, a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think Gary Gygax was probably 28 years old when he founded the International Federation of Wargamers. Yeah. And when you say wargamers, these were people who, they probably played games off the shelf, but that wasn't their thing. These were like very smart people. They liked history. They liked tactical, strategic. They were math kids. And so they would invent their own games. And a lot of times they would like reenact maybe medieval wars or historical things. It was kind of like Risk. Have you ever played Risk?
Yeah.
But they would try and make their own rules and their own systems that were more complex and more, complicated and allowed for more variance and stuff in the game. And each time it could turn out different. It was very, very cool. Yeah. But it was nerds doing cool shit together, whatever. Oh, and by the way, like Gen Con is still going. Yeah. And they moved it to Indianapolis in like 2003, I think. And this year, they just held it this year again. And 70,000 people came to it. So it's like fucking still a huge deal. Yeah. I still would argue that mostly dudes. But there's probably more women there than ever before because that culture has become more inclusive. And it's been okay for women to go like, I'm a nerd, it's cool. Something fateful would happen, though, at the second Gen Con. Gygax met a fellow war game enthusiast named Dave Arneson. So he's 29 at this point, Gary Gygax. He started this thing. He's kind of the fucking king of this whole thing. And he meets this 20-year-old kid named Dave Arneson. And they shared a passion for coming up with the rules, which is the most boring part. So that's why I say huge nerds. Like these are the people that want to sit and talk about. This is why I can't play Dungeons and Dragons. Our son Mason, he's 20. He's a fucking D&D nut. But he is a nut for any game that you sit and spend more time reading and planning
than playing it.
Right. And those are these guys,
Yeah.
right? The game is just a vehicle by which they can be strategic and all this kind of shit.
That I lean in that direction, but I just don't go there. But like if I was gonna, I understand the planning. Like I can, well, because I've told you, this is gonna veer over for a second. I've told you when I was a kid, and me and my sister and my cousin played Barbies. We put hours into the prep of our weekend of Barbie playing because separated out all the Barbies. The clothes, the shoes, the houses, the furniture, the accessories, everything into piles, and then we like drew names for who got to pick what first, and drew and then picked our houses, said everything. And like it was just like an ordeal to even before we even started. It was like, to me, I have vivid memories of the planning. I don't remember what we played once we were playing. That was lame.
Right. But you're still that way.
Yeah.
Like
so
Marnee loves preparing for something more than doing
I would
it.
relate to this.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So it's a personality thing. It's a whatever.
I like to plan play.
I was like
more than play.
I was more like, if I tape this M80 to my sister's Barbie, what will happen when it blows up? That's the planning that went into any kind of thing. But
yeah, that's a funny combination of us. Is I'm into planning and you're into
like video games. If I'm not running around shooting a fool, I don't play it. Like I cannot do that. But these guys were like, and this was before video games as we know them. And I mean, this was men sitting in a room talking about the rules of a game that they're dealing with. So I mean, this is a culture, a subculture, and it becomes this huge support group for these guys and gals who are like super into this stuff. That's not mainstream culture whatsoever, right? So he meets Dave Arneson there, Gary Gygax does. And this is going to become an important duo here soon. So over the next few years, they would both work on other fantasy campaign games individually. And then in late 1973, Gary and Dave would collaborate on the first drafts of what would become Dungeons & Dragons. When Gygax couldn't find a game company to produce D&D, he formed a company with a childhood friend named Don Kay in order to self-publish the game. The name of the company... and this proves that some people, and usually nerds, shouldn't be allowed to name anything, right? So the name so what happens is Gary Gygax reunites with Dave Arneson, and they begin working on this adventure campaign game that instead of medieval war, instead of something like that, it's fantasy. And like it's make believe, and so it opens up all these possibilities. Like you're no longer bound to reality or history. You have all this wealth of like stuff to pull from, right? And so they begin working on the first ideas and the drafts and kind of formulating the basics of what would become Dungeons and Dragons. But when they were done, they shopped it around and they couldn't find anyone to produce this game, right? And if you think about it, I mean, this would be in 1973, and so the games that were around were like, this was not something that was typical.
People were not
pushing the envelope for sure. This was definitely something new, and they couldn't find anyone to publish it. So what they did, he found a friend of his from when he was a kid, and I didn't look deep into this why he was brought in. I don't know if he had money probably, or he knew people that could back it, but they formed a company, and the name of the company, again, terrible name, Tactical Studies Research. Or no, is that right? No. Tactical Studies Rules. I said Tactical Studies Research because that seems fucking more sensical.
That's the name of what?
That's the name of the company that he formed with his friend in order to publish this game.
Tactical Studies Rules?
Yes, which makes no sense, but it became known as TSR. In January of 1974, Dungeons & Dragons' first release They hand assemble 1,000 copies of the game, and within 11 months, they sell every single one of them. So these motherfuckers couldn't sell it through a company, so they decide, we're going to print them and put them together ourselves. So they're like just putting this shit, 1,000 copies together, and in less than a year, they sell every single one of them, which is success. That's good, right? They followed this up with a second 1,000 set printing in 1975, and they sold out in under 6 months, which they immediately followed up with a 2,000 set printing that sold out before the end of the year. So they're kicking ass. So they like do 1,000, and then the next year they go like, let's do another 1,000. And 6 months later they're out.
Yeah.
And then they print 2,000 more, and they're out before the end of the year.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've sold now that they're 2 years in. They're selling copies, and it's starting to like find its way into the popular culture. You know, people are becoming aware. And again, it starts in colleges. It also starts in a lot of like back in when we were kids. Remember like the gifted and talented programs, like what we call now like college prep or I don't know the fuck the advanced placement AP classes. Back then we had like gifted and talented programs where kids that were like a little more advanced would be in different classes, and they started offering Dungeons and Dragons as kind of a because it's very thinky. It's math and it's collaboration and it's strategy. And so they started, it started to kind of make its way into the culture at large. So by 1980, so that's 6 years after they released Dungeons and Dragons, 1980, they were selling 12,000 copies a month, expanding TSR into the UK to meet demand internationally. In 1982, a video game called Dungeon is released by TSR for the Apple II, and D&D begins making its way into popular culture with references in huge movies such as E.T. So, I had an Apple II. I had the benefit of having a dad who said, you know what, computers are the future. And so in like the early 80s, Apple, the same people who brought us the iPhone, they had personal computers, and they were very different than the computers we have now. You had to actually know how to use a computer. There was no mouse. There was no pointing and clicking at shit. There was no pictures. It was words. I was a huge computer nerd, actually, because my dad bought me this computer and then let me loose. And then he bought me a modem. I asked him to buy me a modem, which is the way that you could like dial into computers. Literally, me and my friend wrote a whole like video game, a text-based video game. It was like tens of thousands of lines of like writing code and shit. So this is like a time when, like you said, video games are pretty shitty, and yet they released Apple Computer released a Dungeons and Dragons based game. It was just called Dungeon, but it was based on that world for the computer. And then you start seeing it all over the place, right? So by 1980, they're like fucking kicking ass. It's becoming, and if you think about like 12,000 copies a month, right? That's 144,000 copies a year. And if you imagine that when someone whips out a copy of D&D, there's like 5 or 6 people playing it. That equals a lot of people are playing Dungeons and Dragons now. It's no longer like some dark corner like subculture thing. By 1983, a Dungeons and Dragons cartoon series aired on CBS. Did you ever watch it?
I didn't even know that.
Marnie wasn't into cartoons because she was too mature for them as a child.
I wasn't into cartoons, and I actually didn't have free access to TV all the time. I had limited. It was times I was allowed to. So it just never.
Right. I had free reign of the TV, and I loved cartoons. And I remember watching Dungeons and Dragons. It was so loosely based. It had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons other than there were dragons, and there were probably a couple dungeons in there. But it was just a silly 80s adventure cartoon. But it whipped up a huge frenzy as well, as we'll find out. However, in 1986, Gygax was forced out of TSR as a result of a bunch of corporate political shenanigans. He would go on to produce and collaborate on many other fantasy role-playing games.
Gygax, like the original
The guy who invented it, yes. He eventually was pushed out of TSR.
I hate that.
And then in March 2008, he died at the age of 69.
That's not old. How did he die?
He died of I believe, an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which is when your aorta bursts. And it like bleeds into your abdominal cavity. It's an aneurysm, like a brain aneurysm, but it happens down here.
Is that just a random thing, or is there some kind of health issue that creates that?
It's probably a whole variety of factors, but yeah. I mean, I don't know.
That's,
I don't know. He died, though. We know that.
that's a bummer.
It's sad.
Sad.
And it just goes to show you that the man, no matter where you're at, your fucking corporate world is such bullshit. I say that someone just got laid off by the man recently. Fuck you, man. And so Gary Gygax, this like guy who invented this amazing thing. Yeah, what happened
And then
was,
he
you
got
know,
pushed
people get
out of
involved.
it.
Well, they got
Fuck
huge.
People, that's so fucking.
They got huge. They spread internationally. I think it was like a brothers or a father and son got involved.
Did he at least like have like he definitely had like at least a nice life from the success of it.
Yeah,
like,
I'm sure he did.
Financially taken care of. He wasn't like.
I don't know, but I'm assuming he did pretty well. What happened though was the company kind of, you know, they had to bring on more corporate structure and stuff.
As it grows.
The people who were running it kind of like
But
made
they
some.
don't have to kick him out.
I know. Well, they made some poor. Listen to me. They made some poor choices. Jesus Christ. They made some poor choices, and then Gary Gygax actually came in, took over, saved the company, made them solvent again. Mm-hmm. But what happened is one of the people that basically got kicked out because of their mismanagement, their shares they sold to this woman who came in now with 51%, and she totally restructured shit, and she ended up forcing Gary Gygax out to take over the company. So, I mean, this is just the fucking, it was money that was
so
driving
dumb.
this. Yeah. It is dumb, but it happened, and it's not relevant to our story. So it's just funny. The fact is, though, the important fact is that Gary Gygax invented Dungeons and Dragons with Dave Arneson in 1973, originally, released it in 1974. 6 years later, it is a part of the ethos of our culture. Okay. But in 1979, the year before, they explode in 1980. AD. 1980. You know, from analyzing all of this now and looking back and stuff, as far as could be ascertained, is this was the thing that was the impetus for what would follow, right? Mm-hmm. And it didn't start out as this, it's satanic thing. It started out with a different tone, but then actions from the media and then from this cast of characters that would then flood in and take this tragic thing and use it for their own moral and societal agendas. It's a crazy story. Yeah, okay. So, like I said, it all starts in 1979. I was 9, you were 8, and I wrote some facts down here about 1979 because I thought it'd be interesting to be like, what? I don't fucking.
What was happening?
I was in 3rd grade. I didn't give a shit what was happening.
Oh, I remember. Oh, then I was in 2nd grade, right?
Yes. So in 1979, the Sony Walkman was released.
Really?
Yes. How much do you think it cost to buy?
When I was in 2nd grade?
That's when the Sony Walkman was released, 1979. That's a fact. How much do you think it cost? Like in 1979 dollars, how much do you think it cost?
It was probably hundreds.
It was $200.
Yeah.
$200 fucking dollars. Do you know how much that would be now? I didn't look it up, but it would be for a, you can go into a thrift store and buy a Sony Walkman for 50 cents right now, by the way. If you could even find one.
You could probably buy my old iPhone too for that.
Right, and we laugh about that, but the Walkman changed fucking everything. You couldn't walk around. You could walk around with a radio.
Yeah.
And there was headphones with radios built in there.
Yes, the big headphones or the boombox, but that
was
that happening? Were people walking around with the boombox? See, I thought
in 79, probably.
Yeah.
Definitely they were. But that was still cumbersome, right? You couldn't bring a tape with you though and play something compact. You couldn't go for a jog and listen to music. I
thought that was a new thing like in my 5th, 6th, 7th grade.
Well, Sony released it in 1979, and it literally revolutionized everything. It was a huge fucking deal. It was like the iPod being released. It was the same thing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we just didn't.
No, I remember.
Yeah,
I remember having one and thinking it was so freaking
right.
But I was like older by the time I got one.
What do you think the top song of 1979 was?
Disco song?
Would I characterize it as a disco song? Okay, I'm gonna do something and then you're gonna know what it is.
Okay.
Do 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 do
Oh.
do 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 do.
The Knack. Yes.
The Knack, My Sharona.
Oh,
that was the top song.
Hell yeah.
Which is
takes me back to my mom's white leather
Yes.
interior, white outside T-top Mustang.
Because your parents had just gotten divorced, so your mom was feeling herself hard in 1979.
Blasting my Sharona with the T-tops off and the white leather.
Yeah.
And the 8-track tape.
It was kind of the golden days of divorce, right? Because that sounds bad, but so it was in 1969 that the first no-fault divorce laws went into effect in California, in the state that we were in. It was the first time that a woman could say, fuck you, I don't want to be married to you. And they didn't have to prove infidelity. Yeah. They didn't need their husband's permission. Yeah. They could literally say, I don't care, I just don't want to be in this marriage anymore. And so women who got divorced in the 70s, you think they get loose now. They got loose then because it was freedom that they had never
And
really...
they also get shunned from...
society.
Polite society.
Right.
They get completely shunned. So everybody that was shunned from polite society... in every subculture, gathered together to support each other because they were kicked out of and not supported, and they were deemed as evil by everybody else.
So Marnie's mom was getting shunned, but she was in her white Mustang listening to the most popular song of 1979, My Sharona by The Knack. And like I said, also that year, Pink Floyd released their album The Wall, which is a very famous album. And you've heard that song, like, all in all, it's just another brick in the wall.
No. See, I do not know Pink Floyd. I've never heard that
That's
song.
Marnie's experience of the world. And she has no fucking idea. Okay, well, you do know also this year...
It's like if my mom didn't listen to it, I didn't listen to it.
This one you'll know. Another album that was released that year, Michael Jackson, Off the Wall.
Okay, so I didn't listen to Michael Jackson until junior high, but I knew that he had that Off the Wall. Once I got into him, I knew his previous album names, but
we probably shouldn't be talking about Michael Jackson too much in our current climate. We're like, oh, Michael Jackson.
Anyway, he existed.
Right. The first snowboard was invented in 1979.
Snowboard?
The first snowboard.
Wow.
By a dude with the last name of Burton.
Oh, yeah?
I'm pretty sure that's true fact. I'm just saying that. I'm pretty sure that Burton Snowboards is founded by the dude. I don't remember his name. His last name's Burton. I don't remember his first name. But I'm pretty sure he invented the first true snowboard.
Interesting.
The average price of a gallon of gas was 88 cents.
Oh, yeah.
The first Strawberry Shortcake doll was released that year.
Totally remember Strawberry
Hell
Shortcake.
yeah. The world population, 4.3 billion.
What is it now?
7.6 billion.
Interesting.
That's how fucking 40 years have gone by.
Almost doubled in 40 years.
Crazy, right?
Or wait, is that double?
I mean, pretty close. Not quite.
Because it was 40. What did you say the first?
4.3 billion. 4.3, so double that would be 8.6. Okay, we're at 7.6. So we're almost double. I mean, there's a billion people to go before it's doubled, so it's not like almost, but still. The minimum wage. What do you think the minimum wage was?
Like $1 or something.
No.
No, it was more.
$2.90.
Yeah.
I remember when I started.
When I was 16, I remember what it was.
What was it?
$3.25.
Was it $3.25 or $3.35? Because I remember being 15 and I got my first job at a surf shop. I'm pretty sure I got paid $3.35
well, but doesn't
an
mean
hour.
that maybe they gave you a 10 cent bump up minimum. Because I think it was $3.25.
I just got a 10-cent raise off the bat.
Yeah,
I was like
they were
a
like,
fucking good
"You're
worker.
so cool."
10 cents. Oh my god.
You're worth 10 cents more than the lowest.
That was the year also that the hostages were taken from the embassy in Iran, and that's when Iran switched from a democracy to a fucking
I didn't know
Islamic
what was
state.
going on, but I remember hearing about the hostages all the time.
Yep.
But I didn't know what was happening. It's just Iran hostages.
Right. And in the movies, the China Syndrome hit theaters portraying a nuclear meltdown due to a faulty sensor reading and a stuck-open pressure release valve. 12 days later, the 3 Mile Island meltdown happened in Pennsylvania, caused by a faulty sensor reading and a stuck-open pressure release valve. It's fucking crazy. But I remember 3 Mile Island. I remember this is what I remember of 3 Mile Island. I remember sitting, playing with Stretch Armstrong or some shit.
Yeah.
And my dad watching the news, and it just 3 Mile Island constantly was coming up. But that's what happened in 1979. So that's the world we're in. It was a very different world than we have today.
So funny how your memory, when you put all that in 1 year, because I wouldn't have put those things in that same time frame. The way our memory remembers things is not right.
And we've had discussions
It's
of
not
how
accurate.
we've had discussions of how we grew up in the 70s, technically our childhood. We came of age in the 80s because that's when we were 10 to 20. But we had a childhood in the 70s and we didn't really pay attention obviously to what was going on. And so later in our adult life, we went back and watched documentaries and shit about the 70s and stuff. And oh my God.
It's so crazy how you see, like you said, we didn't know what was going on. But when you watch what was happening, it makes how childhood felt makes sense.
Yeah,
It connects with how I felt as a child. What was happening in the world is really interesting.
How'd you feel as a child?
Times felt like the world was scary out there. I was in a kind of a secluded world, but there was also this feeling like there was scary stuff out there. And maybe that's just childhood, just the world feels scary. But
no, I think it was scarier than now.
Yeah,
it was.
There was some crazy stuff going on
right.
at that time.
I know now everyone's like, no, it couldn't have been scary. Look at all the bad news. But that's because we're plugged into fucking everything that's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Back then, you just got the highlights and they were fucking frightening. So just the things that made it into the whatever sphere you were in were bad. I mean, people were waiting in line for gas. You could only get gas if your license plate ended in an odd number or an even number. You had to go on certain days.
I remember that.
Shit was bad. The economy was terrible.
You know, it's funny, as a kid, you don't know that. You don't feel it, but you hear them talking about it, complaining about it, but you don't feel it because you're eating dinner every night.
And we had just transitioned from
middle class, anyways.
Right. We just transitioned from the hippies of the 60s who had all this idealism and they were going to change the world with love and all this bullshit. And then it didn't happen.
Yeah.
It fell apart. The fucking Manson family happened and,
and
the whole thing.
The hippies went crazy in the 70s. I feel like they got aggressive and crazy. They were the terrorists.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, did I?
It's those disillusioned hippies who found out,
people aren't going to
peaceful protest doesn't work. Let's bomb the fuck out of them. So our domestic terrorists in the 70s were idealistic white kids. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They weren't a bunch of, scary, Muslim terrorists or whatever they're trying to tell us is happening now. Yeah. So 1979 is where this whole Dungeons and Dragons panic start. It didn't start when they released it. In fact, no one really said shit in the preceding years, from 1974 to 1979. It was just making its way into college campuses. Like I said, before 1980, they were selling a few thousand a year. So, that college student brought up in the intro, his name was James Egbert, but he went by Dallas. I'm going to call him Dallas. I feel like he would want me to call him Dallas because if you say people call me Dallas, you want them to call you that. He was a highly gifted student who had repaired computers for the Air Force when he was 12 years old. So not only did this kid go into Michigan State University at the age of 15, in 1975, when he was 12, he was repairing computers for the Air Force. The Air Force hired him to repair their computers. And again, there are people who would be like, my 12-year-old can use a computer. No, he can't. No. Your 12-year-old is a fucking idiot compared to this kid because your kid can point and click and touch little icons. Right. This kid was dealing with computers where he had to program it with binary, hexadecimal numbers. Yeah. He understood how the computer worked. Yeah. And when you're using computers in 1975 in the Air Force, that means those computers probably came from the 60s. Yeah. So it's even more archaic. So this kid was not just smart, okay? And we're going to find out a lot of times when you find kids like this that are this smart, there are other things that are off, right? Now we live in a world where we talk about people on a spectrum and we have all these diagnoses and stuff. And we notice a lot of times, not always, but sometimes they do have this kind of special feature about them.
Yeah, you can't, our brain has a capacity. Right. You can either use it over here for social engagement and understanding all of that stuff. And if you having excess over here with all this computation and stuff, there's only so much space that the brain no one has a actually bigger brain. Right. Space in it is not going to contain the ability to have also the social
Right.
stuff and all this geniusness.
Right.
It just makes sense.
Right. We're humans and we're limited by a lot of things.
Yeah.
You know, this is like why people will be like, wouldn't it be cool if we could fly? If a human being had wings and could fly, you would have to eat 24 hours a day to do so,
Yeah.
right? Because there's an energy in and out that's required. And the same comes to our brains. I think you have a good point. Like, there are trade-offs that have to take
Yeah.
place because we don't have infinite
Yeah.
capacity.
Yep.
Just like a computer, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can only get a computer to do what it has the capacity to
Capability,
do, and if you push it beyond that, it says sorry. You know. He was also incredibly socially anxious, troubled, and by all accounts struggling with his sexuality. So much so that he had developed a pretty gnarly drug habit, even making his own PCP in his dorm room. Okay, this is a 16-year-old kid. He's clearly gay. He was a member of the Gay Student Association and this is 1979, okay? Our son, who is 20 years old, shout out to Mason, our avid D&D player, he is also gay. He came out to us when he was in junior high, in middle school, and even in this world of support, and all his friends supported him, his school had resources that supported him, there were community groups in our city that supported him, he still struggled to tell us. Like, he texted us from his upstairs bedroom and said, don't fucking come up here after I tell you this. And even though he knew we had no problems with it, right? It's a difficult thing for anyone to come to grips maybe with something that's outside of what's considered whatever norm or whatever. This kid was a 16-year-old child in an
Already
adult
way out.
world,
Yeah, already way out of the norm.
confused, probably autistic, probably. Like, we would probably call him that. He had a ton of social anxiety. He didn't fit in. He's out of his element. And he turns to drugs to self-medicate. And not just, he's not smoking weed. He's making angel dust. He's making PCP and doing it. So this kid's struggling, right? This is not a good situation. I don't know what the fuck his parents were doing right now. I really don't. I don't know if they knew what was going on or if they were...
It was just like, I think back then, you know, as kids were just an extension of their parents' ego.
Still,
I mean, that's a normal thing. It still happens, but I mean, we had no concept of it back then. So it was just like free reign to just like send your kid out into the world, and they have these gifts, and then you just puffs you up like,
fuck yeah.
go do this, and like they're
Fuck
not.
yeah. We felt that our entire stint as parents, right? We've been parents since we were 18 years old, essentially, and I constantly am battling with, don't use your kids as some vicarious way for you to demonstrate how fucking good you are.
They're not just an extension of you. They're individuals, and
Right.
So they had no concept of that back then.
Right. So Dallas, this is a situation he's in.
So sad.
So sad, right? And such a special kid, obviously. Like, this kid was not, you know, he was something different than you would expect. Upon his disappearance, his uncle hired a self-proclaimed cult deprogrammer and private investigator named William Deere. Deere traced Egbert's whereabouts to a system of steam tunnels under the campus after he claims he found D&D books in Egbert's dorm room.
So he's got family.
He's got family, and he has...
No, that was the end of my sentence. He's like struggling to come out. He's got all this stuff. He's struggling. And then if he's got an uncle that would hire a deprogrammer, that tells me immediately his family's hyper-religious.
They didn't hire him because they thought he needed to be deprogrammed, but William Deere, the guy he hired, has that, he had that self...
Why did they hire a deprogrammer then?
Well, understand that in the 70s, especially the late 70s. So what happened was a lot of the hippies and kids, because they were so disillusioned in the late 60s and early 70s, cults were a huge deal in the 70s.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Way more than now.
No, yeah, I know.
So there was a lot of people running around claiming to be cult deprogrammers. And this guy had kind of gotten a reputation for being able to hunt down young people and find them.
Oh, and there was an assumption that because he was missing, he got taken into a cult. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm sure that he probably had been on the TV. I didn't look this up, but he was a fucking media whore, shameless self-promoting guy.
Yeah.
Right? As we'll find out. But his uncle apparently had money or something because it wasn't. I mean, I saw some accounts that his parents hired him, but the most credible accounts I could find said that it was his uncle. Okay, and later on in the story, his uncle's going to show up again, and I think that he had some kind of, prominent position in his family. Deer traced Egbert's whereabouts to a system of steam tunnels under the campus after he claims that he found D&D books in Egbert's dorm room.
Yeah.
So, William Deer shows up at Michigan State University because the kid disappears, Dallas disappears, and no one can find him, and they start getting worried, so they hire this PI. He shows up, goes and searches his dorm room, and he finds Dungeons and Dragons books, okay? And he begins to weave this tale and kind of hears that college kids will sometimes go, there was this old steam plant that used to heat the campus, and there was all these tunnels underneath it. And so kids would go down there to explore them and, like I said, to LARP and stuff. And so he kind of picks up this trail based off of this stuff that he finds in his dorm room. From Joseph Laycock's Dangerous Games, quote, Deer homed in on Dallas's interest in D&D and constructed a highly imaginative scenario in which Dallas had become the victim of his own fantasy world. At one point, he even suggested that a mysterious dungeon master might have warped Dallas's mind and was now using him as bait to lure investigators into his mad game. Okay. In this story, what you find is a bunch of people who are saying these kids are caught in a fantasy, okay? And they can't tell reality from fantasy anymore. And they're acting out these roles in the real world and ending up dead. But in reality, it's a bunch of kids playing a game. And then a bunch of people who are acting out a fantasy. And William Deer's fantasy is, I'm a hero. I'm fighting the bad guys. I'm the ultimate. It's like this John Wayne persona. These are all older dudes. They all have that World War II movie persona. And so William Deer begins to weave this crazy story about how this devious dungeon master has taken him hostage, or maybe somehow taken control of his mind, and he's getting him to do things. And now William Deer is the genius on the other side who's going to go head to head with this strategic genius it's a movie that this guy is literally projecting out into the world. Yeah. And unfortunately, there's this special young man whose life is fucking in the balance of it, right? So the search goes on for several weeks, ending up with Dallas calling William Deer from Morgan City, Louisiana. So apparently...
Oh, he was still alive.
He was still alive. Apparently, Dallas calls William Deer and says, here I am.
The deprogrammer guy?
Yeah, the PI.
Okay.
Tells him where he is, or either he called him or people who he told to call him. Somehow he was contacted and told how to get to him. He shows up, and basically the story is what happened was Dallas wanted to kill himself. So he went down to the steam tunnels, not because it had anything to do with LARPing or Dungeons and Dragons, but because it would be a really convenient place to kill yourself if you wanted to do it. Yeah. So he goes down there. He takes a bunch of Quaaludes, probably one of the most 70 things you could ever do, and hopes to die. But he wakes up. He's not successful. Yeah. He knows people are looking for him. He runs and stays with a friend in Lansing, Michigan, which is where Michigan State University is. So he's in town.
Why run?
Well, first of all, it's hard for us to understand what he was dealing with, right? This is a kid who has issues. I'm sure there's embarrassment. He's 16 years old and forced into a world that he's not prepared to deal with. He's fucking strung out on hardcore drugs. He's struggling. He wants to die. So he's not going to be like, oh, I'm here, like he's in a psyche that we can't possibly understand. So he kind of like stays with friends in town, friends that they think that he had through kind of the underground gay community in town. First of all, the fact that this is a 16-year-old kid plugged into the gay community in Lansing, Michigan is troubling to me. Yeah. But after a while, he bails. He's like, I gotta get out of town. Before he left his dorm room to kill himself, he left a suicide note, okay? And this is what the suicide note said. To whom it may concern, should my body be found, I wish it to be cremated. That was it. That's what he said, okay? There was no like, I'm tormented because this fantasy game or I'm being lured in and this person's making me. It was just like, I want to die, basically, and I'm sorry. You can read the under the subtext is kind of like, just burn me up. Like you could even sense in him like this idea that he just thought he was worthless. Like if you find me, cremate me. So he leaves Lansing, Michigan on a bus for New Orleans, where he drank cyanide again, trying to kill himself. Again, he does not succeed. He then moves to Morgan City, Louisiana, where he gets work in an oil field as a laborer. But after 4 days, he's like, fuck this. And he winds up calling William Deere to come get him. So, according to Deere, James made him promise not to reveal the truth about where he had been. And thus, his Dungeons and Dragons theory and the media's reporting of it being tied to his disappearance continued to worm its way into the collective consciousness of the public. It even spawned urban legends about college students going into steam tunnels to engage in fantasy games, losing their grip with reality, and winding up lost or dead. But James was still alive and was handed over to the custody of his uncle by William Deere. When Deere finds him alive, and, the media reports it, he doesn't say anything about the fact that this had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. His theory that he floated, this grand scheme. And he was in the press a lot. Like I said, he loved being on TV. He loved being seen as this ultra smart guy who could he just, he was playing a role. He was fucking living a fantasy himself. He had his own hero's journey happening, and he was, living it out on live TV. When he finds out that that's not at all what happened, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't and the story he tells is that he didn't say what happened because Dallas didn't want him to say anything. I have different ideas about that we'll see later. But as this goes on, he allows this D&D narrative to just play out in the media. And they're still talking about the disappearance of James Egbert, being tied to D&D, even though now he's alive, and, a few months later, and had nothing to do with that, right? He just was struggling. He was tormented. He was giving himself, I'm assuming he's really smart, but I don't know what PCP is made of or whatever, but I'm assuming that it's something that you don't want to put in your brain and you don't want variants of it put in your brain, that's seems crazy. He was tortured, wanted to die, and he failed twice, and he's embarrassed, and he's gay, and that's like a shame, and there's all this stuff going on.
There's no him coming out and telling his side of the story. It's like,
no way.
Run.
No way.
Avoid.
Yeah, and so he's handed over to the custody of his uncle by William Deere. So I don't know. I didn't look into that, but his uncle kind of plays prominently, so I don't know what the fuck's going on. Why didn't he go to his parents? Right. I don't know. Okay. There's a lot of speculation. You may be like, what was fucking up at home that is causing this much? Because there are kids who go to college early and struggle because they're kids and shouldn't be in that world. But most of them don't make PCP in their dorm room and take it. Most of them don't take handloads of, Quaaludes and then fucking cyanide. And something was up, and who knows what the roots of it were. But that doesn't really matter because that's not really pertinent to the story. Where we're at, though, is he disappears. D&D becomes somehow tied to this. He's found alive. The story has nothing to do with D&D, but William Deere doesn't say shit. Nobody says shit. Yeah. And so this virus that's now entered the media begins to propagate and find its way into other sectors of society and culture who pick it up and then take their own agenda and spin on it, right? Where maybe he could have kind of nipped this in the bud and said, I had nothing to do with that. But that wasn't his style because that would make him look like he was wrong or what, there's all kinds of shit going on. However, tragically on August 16th, 1980, a year and 1 day later, he disappeared on August 15th, 1979. On August 16th, 1980, at the age of 17, James killed himself. He shot himself in the head. It's a sad story, but it's also a profoundly socially impacting story. Not because of the human tragedy factor. That wasn't highlighted in the coverage of Egbert's story. Instead, fanciful theories about Dungeons and Dragons ignited deep, dark fears in the imagination of the impressionable masses. And it might not have panned out that way had it not been for two shameless profiteers, a novelist named Rona Jaffe and the aforementioned William Deere. So, This is the origin point of the Satanic Panic around Dungeons and Dragons. It was an obscure thing up to this point. The only people that heard of Dungeons and Dragons were college kids and nerds, like ultra nerds, not what we call nerds today. People that were this deep subculture, they knew about it. But it wasn't like the average mom knew shit about any of this, right? What happens is when Dallas goes missing and then a year later kills himself, the speculation around that tied to Dungeons and Dragons is what then goes from there. Even though it had zero to do, Satan wasn't brought up. It wasn't a religious thing. It was is our imagination, is a child's imagination so rich and so, it's in this formational period that if we introduce them to this, like, playing a role and putting yourself so deeply into this, is it going to cause them to go crazy and kill themselves? It was like a psychological thing and not like a spiritual thing yet.
Yeah. Well, with that information about what he was struggling with, homosexuality, not fitting into quote unquote normal society, mental illness, and whatever, just that culture that doesn't want to look at that issues of culture, like he didn't fit, which is why he would not want to exist in this world.
Right.
So they can't look at themselves and be self-aware and be like, we created a world he didn't fit into. That's what killed him. They have to be like, it's the devil.
Right. And we'll get to that mostly in the next episode. So this episode doesn't have a lot to do with like the devil and like the satanic part of the panic.
No, I'm just tying it. I'm not.
No. I'm agreeing with you.
I'm just saying our need to find, to not be blamed and not look at ourselves and society and what was really going on with him, but calling it the devil is so. That has been the culture forever. Just call it the devil. Don't look at what we're doing.
Yeah, we love a good scapegoat.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you don't know where that term comes from, the term scapegoat actually comes from the Old Testament of the Bible. Yeah, and so what they would do is there were two goats, and they'd lay their hands on one goat, and they would kind of like transfer the sins of the nation of Israel or whatever onto this goat, and then they would let it go.
Yep.
And but that was
outside the city.
They would lead it outside the camp, first, and then they would let it go, right? And you see such a human psychological drama playing out there, and that reality is very hard for our consciousness. We are creatures that experience reality in a certain way.
Okay, so that's interesting. To have a ritual that would let us use imagery to relieve us of our guilt, because if we kind of, I wonder if like we used story and imagery to do that, because like I've studied hypnotherapy, like you change the images and you change your subconscious and how it behaves. So you have an image of taking all that you've done that you regret and putting it on something and sending it away. Then that removes it.
Right.
We don't do that ritual anymore, so we actually do that to other people.
That's a good point.
We put it on people and cast them out rather than play out a ritual with a fucking goat, which probably would be better than putting it on a person and torturing them for life.
Right. And there's like obviously the same kind of thing plays out in like therapeutic modes and things. Like I remember going to a therapist and her telling me that when certain thoughts or whatever come in, imagine a river with a bunch of leaves going by, and you put that thought that's damaging or hard to deal with or whatever on a leaf and just let it go away, and it's gone, right? So
imagery.
Right.
And when we're not doing that, we're doing it to each other.
Right. And the problem comes when we begin to, in our scapegoating, we assign reality to it. Yeah. And that's what...
When we don't deal with our minds as making up stories and dealing with subconscious emotions and creating scenarios. We don't deal with it in like that honest way. We literally believe the craziness in our minds,
Right.
and do horrible things to each other.
I mean, honestly, I think that playing Dungeons and Dragons would probably have been the best thing for Dallas to do, because it presented this imaginary world where he could act out the things that he was feeling in this detached way.
Yes.
That making decisions that he couldn't bring himself to make. You know, like I feel like it was actually probably the best thing that was going on for him, and it turned into the thing that, because they didn't want to deal with the reality that this kid did not fit the mold, they fucking, allowed this crazy PI guy to come up with this like self-fulfilling prophecy kind of idea of like, and it just like replicates out in the media. And they're really the ones to blame in all of this, to be honest. There's fucking wacky people. There's crazy church ladies. There's fucking, horrible men who step into the fray to like do the shit, and we'll look into all their various problems and stuff like that. That's all. They're always around. We have fucking wacky people around now. Yeah. The thing is, the media played this up, and they did not push back. They did not. They just saw it. And this was the very beginning of like entertainment media. The 24-hour news cycle had just gotten going. And news was transitioning from a dude or a woman that you sat at 6 o'clock.
A dude. No woman.
In the 70s, there were women. It was the age of that when that was starting to happen. I'm sure they got treated poorly, but they were trying to like do things.
She was like a little trophy piece of the desk.
Remember like Connie Chung, and they were in the 80s, but they started in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Jane Pauley.
Yeah.
These were like actually majorly trusted news folks. And you used to listen to them tell you the facts, but then it transitioned into more, how do we hook the emotions of people to get them to watch? And so this was a story that was like ripe for that. So Dallas disappears. William Deere comes in, says that it has something to do with Dungeons and Dragons, which was far more about him fulfilling his own fantasy. It had nothing to do with actuality. He finds him a month later, and he's alive, but then a year later, he kills himself. But when he kills himself, nobody says, oh, remember that kid who left, whatever. No one reports this shit or anything like that, right? It's still that the disappearance set the narrative, right? And it's not corrected. It's just allowed to replicate, okay? And once it's allowed to replicate, what we'll see is then it's just this material that when other tragic teenage boys kill themselves because of societal issues and our inability to like fucking identify this and like really help them, it becomes this easy thing now. And pretty soon any boy that kills himself probably was playing Dungeons and Dragons, shit like that. Now remember, in 1980 TSR starts selling 12,000 copies of D&D a month. That was because of the media coverage of Dallas's disappearance and suicide. So they will tell you, TSR will say like, this had fucking nothing to do with that kid's death.
Yeah.
However, when the media starts talking about it,
people are like, what's that?
No, you should see the graph. I've seen the graph of their sales. It is nuts. They're like, we didn't know how to feel because we felt terrible.
Well, that's what they say. Any, what is it? Any. Shit.
No publicity is bad publicity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is totally true.
Totally true.
And this was largely the beginning of the information age, cable TV, and all of these things were starting to come on. Like, we were being exposed to more things, and things were being exposed to more people than ever before. And so, yeah, it totally played into this capitalistic kind of thing of like, even bad press is beneficial if when you're selling shit. So, in July of 1982, so 2 years after he killed himself, Rona Jaffe released her book, Mazes and Monsters. Because she couldn't use Dungeons and Dragons because TSR would sue the fuck out of her. So she calls it Mazes and Monsters. Jesus Christ. You should see the book, too. It looks like the cover of a romance novel, right? It's this very 1982 book. In it, a group of troubled college students get into a game which is a clunky representation of D&D. The novel was written in a matter of a few days because she was afraid someone might capitalize on the Egbert death before her. So, this kid, I mean, this is the most fucking tragic. This is a tragic story.
Yeah.
No one fucking gives a shit about this poor kid.
Yeah.
In our day today, he would be someone that would be held up as a martyr and like we would like push legislation. But in his day, it was just a convenient way to fucking make a buck and take advantage of the fear and panic and the kind of like consciousness of society that was starting to like become really afraid of these things. She clearly knows little about RPGs, the culture, or the people who play them. She simply took the fear whipped up by the media and spun it into a ridiculous book. It, of course, became a bestseller because we're fucking morons. Anytime someone says best-selling book, I'm like, fuck you, that book's probably stupid then because a bunch of people like it, you idiots.
Yeah, I didn't. There's some crazy. I'm not gonna name because make people. But these books that people like go crazy over, that I've just heard are totally poor writing.
Yeah.
Series of books that became movies and all of that.
Yeah.
There's a couple too that are today popular. I'm not gonna say them.
I actually like Marnee and I have this thing in common. Like our personalities are very different, but there's this one thing we have in common where it's like, if you're telling me that I need to watch this, fuck off. Fuck off. I'll watch it when I'm goddamn good and ready, and I'm not jumping on the bandwagon with you idiots.
God.
Yeah, like if you say this movie won the Academy Award, I'm like, not watching that one. Fuck you. It's probably stupid. It's funny. We're like these like rebels.
But then no.
But not really.
That's funny. That's funny. Yeah, because we'll turn away from some of them. We're like, we'll get into our little obsessions that everyone's doing too, and
that are better than everyone's. All right, but so she writes. So Rana Jaffe writes this book called Mazes and Monsters. Okay, and so the plot line is essentially a group of kids, and it's so fucking it's so formulaic and cut and dry. Like each kid has this like missing piece of them, you know, because of the Dallas situation. D&D gets tied to this disaffected kid.
Was this a secular writer, or was she?
She's secular. Yeah, it had nothing to do with. She didn't even talk about. It's not religious or spiritual either. That the early days of the D&D panic was more about, is this psychologically damaging our kids and causing young boys mostly to kill themselves because they get lost in a delusion and they no longer can tell reality from fantasy. Mm-hmm. It is not yet. Satan is luring my kid into the ways of darkness through this game. Not yet. So so her angle is not D&D is bad. Her angle is D&D can cause probably. I mean every fucking buddy was in the
culture. Just if you're demonizing something, whether you are going a churchgoer or religious or not. When you demonize something and look to lay blame in fantastical ways. And
I don't think
that's our culture.
Right.
It's just our culture, which is Christian.
Right.
Christianity does that. Whether you claim the religion or not, you're in a Christian nation. I know we hate to say that, but that's the dominant religion in America, and so it affects our culture. So even when you are not raised in it, it creates your thinking.
Right. I think people. I mean, one thing that is true about the United States is we were founded, the colonies were settled by the fucking religious, crazy nutbags that got kicked out of England and other places.
By other crazy religious nutbags.
Yes, but people...
Just ones that disagreed with them.
Yeah, in the case of England, I would say... It was decidedly less crazy, the Church of England. It had become
they were like, you guys are crazy. We're not letting you.
Well, yeah, because they were, you know, the fucking people that you see on TV that are just like, what the fuck is happening? That was the same reality to them. These were people that refused to take part in society because they fucking saw Satan under every goddamn thing and behind every plot. They had this constant martyr complex that everyone was out to get them, that their religion was being oppressed and all this kind of shit. When it was like, no, you're just being crazy and we can't have a society with you running rampant.
So they shipped him off to America.
So they went to America, where they founded a nation that is not a Christian nation, but is a society that is through and through polluted with crazy religious.
Polluted. That means dirty.
Yeah.
That means putrefied, bad, not drinkable, bad water.
I don't know if there's ever been a society on this planet of humans who have come up and believed crazier things than our society. Period. No, fuck you. I do not think so. You could go back and say like, well, this culture believed this. It is tame compared to the bullshit that you can hear on right-wing talk radio every day or televangelists or some fucking podcast of some nut. We are free to express the craziest shit because you used to get kicked out or killed if you fucking did that shit. Yeah. So our freedom of speech has allowed all kinds of crazy, which I'm not saying I don't want speech to be hindered. Yeah. I just want people to go, those are crazy people. We don't listen to them.
Experiment when you allow people freedom, what they do with it.
That's why we call this the American experiment, because it is kind of like, let's let people fucking be who they are and see what happens.
And we have this idealistic, they're going to be great if we give them freedom.
Right. And it's equal parts awesome and maddening sometimes. Because you're like, can we lock that person up so they don't hurt more people? And we're like, no. And we're like, oh, right. Because they're saying the same thing about us. Like, you know. So, anyway, this book seemed like a fucking push for profits. Like she saw something and was afraid that someone was going to capitalize on it. A young, troubled boy's death, I remind you. But what she played upon was this whole trope of like the disaffected, awkward, troubled gamer, right? Which is still with us today. You know, some people, when they hear my kid plays Dungeons & Dragons, they immediately think, oh, he's some troubled young person, right? And that's largely rooted in this beginnings. Because it was a troubled young person. He was tangentially attached to D&D. No one even really says that he played a game of D&D at MSU, by the way. He did play Dungeons & Dragons probably before he got there. But no one that I could read that interviewed people and looked into this could find someone that played it with him. Yeah. So he wasn't some avid thing. It was just a connection that he found in the materials in his room. Which, when I was a kid, and my friends trying to rope me into playing D&D, and this is when D&D was evil, and so I was like super down with it. Like, I'm like, fuck yeah. But then I play 15 minutes and I'm like, oh, when do I get to do anything? You know, like it's math. It felt like homework. And so... Yeah, but when I would look through them, like the monster manuals and the things, it was so fucking cool. It really was. Like the art was cool. It was just this really cool story. It was so imaginative and it was so awesome. Yeah. And it felt like almost like playing a Saturday morning cartoon in a kind of almost choose your own adventure kind of thing where, you know, there's this dungeon master who's kind of controlling the game, and then every time it could be different. Like I got the appeal. I was just fucking like hyperactive. I couldn't like deal with just sitting there and waiting. And so because he was troubled and the media then grabbed onto this D&D theory that William Deere floated in his fantasy of being this mastermind investigator who beats the evil genius, we end up connecting the two. And so now, and then Rona Jaffe in this book definitely plays it up. So every character, like some of them have typical stuff like, oh, their parents are fighting or got divorced, or it's so funny. One of the kids, his big problem is every time he goes home from school, his mom has redecorated his room, right? And he's just so bummed out because his mom won't let him have his own style. And so he dresses all crazy and wears like different hats and weird shit all the time in order to like express himself because his mom has like taken control of his interior design instincts or some shit, which is like, that is the most laughable problem for a teenage boy to have in 1982. But anyway, the point is each one of the characters have this like emptiness in them, and that's why they're drawn to the game, right? So the idea is kind of like if they were complete and healthy, they wouldn't play Dungeons and Dragons. So the book, I'm going to talk about the book mostly through the movie because the movie's fucking hilarious. So the 80s were big. Remember the TV movie?
They made that book into a movie?
Remember in the 80s, the TV movie was a big deal. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, like a Lifetime movie type thing?
Well,
no,
there was no Lifetime, but there was just ABC Movie of the Week.
Oh, right.
Remember different networks, they would do movies, and usually it was on weekends.
Sunday night.
Right.
Yes.
But these were TV studios.
So crazy.
And in the 1970s, like now we're living in the age of peak TV where TV shows get hundreds of millions of dollars budgets and they hire this was the 70s and 80s, which TV was not like, the movies were still the blockbuster. That's where all the money was going. TV was definitely a lesser form. So TV movies were a lesser form of movie. So
totally.
A movie of the book, a TV movie of the book was released in 1982 on CBS. It followed the story elements of the book and preys upon the cultural idea that D&D was causing kids to engage in dangerous behavior and winding up in a fantasy delusion, losing their grip on reality and winding up in real trouble. At one point, one of the friends finds a cavern where they begin playing mazes and monsters in an attempt to live out their
movie
fantasy.
Called Mazes
and Monsters?
Oh.
And it starred a young actor as the lead role. The character in the book, Robbie, he was played by a young actor. So this is in 1982. Who do you think it was?
Scott Baio?
Scott Baio? No, it wasn't Scott Baio.
What? Wait,
It wasn't
it
Chachi.
Later. I know, it would be later.
It would be... There was a TV show on, a TV series on that starred this actor.
Okay.
It's a TV show that would not fly at all today. It was about two young men who couldn't get into a college, but they could get into this all-girls school.
Bosom Buddies.
Okay, and so
Tom
Hanks played
was in
the
this
lead
Monsters
role.
and Mate.
Yes.
Oh, what?
Yeah, so Tom Hanks in his Bosom Buddy days. If you don't know what
movie.
Bosom Buddies is, go look it up on YouTube. You can watch episodes of it.
Oh gosh, I would like to watch that again. It has been.
It would literally offend everyone in our culture today. It was just a very
so
70s,
funny.
80s show.
Tom Hanks? Tom Hanks was in this movie.
Hanks. I think he was 28, maybe? 28 or 29 years old.
Mazes and Monsters.
He was in Mazes and Monsters. Yes, he was.
Wow.
So the main character, Robbie, as I said, hilariously played by young Tom Hanks in his Bosom Buddy days, has a psychotic episode while exploring the cavern and winds up believing he is a character from the game. He starts dreaming about a place called the Great Hall, is told in a dream to go to the two towers, and then disappears.
I mean, as an actor, that sounds like a great role to play. To get into that and like read that script, and you're like, I would just love to. So he's not thinking of the political effects or the societal effects of perpetuating this story. He's just an actor reading the script going, that's a fucking cool role to play.
He is just a young actor trying to get roles.
Tom
Hanks is not at all attached to the story, other than the fact that it's hilarious that this guy that we consider the greatest actor was a fucking hilarious.
Yeah.
Like
you read a script and you're like, I'll do that.
A lot of people watched it. It was taking advantage of a cultural thing that was just coming online. Yeah. A lot of people were going to watch it.
They never even used the word online.
They didn't even say online. I've watched this movie. It's terrible. But, like, literally terrible. The only people that liked this movie were moms because it made them afraid for their children, right? Which was a big deal in 1982. So here's what...
It's not... Moms being afraid for their children is not a big thing in 1982. It's a big thing all the time.
No, I understand that. But that's primarily why people consume shit now. That's true. What I'm saying is the same. So, but in the movie of the book, right, which follows the book, Robbie, Tom Hanks, is this character who... he got super obsessed with mazes and monsters before in high school or some shit and had to stop playing, so they already set up this thing of like, oh, he's already unstable because he can't control his like whatever. That becomes a major thing.
He got obsessed with it and then they like had to stop and he couldn't not stop playing it. Is that what they're saying?
Well, that's what caused him to stop before is that he became so obsessed with it he got lost in it and so they had to stop it, right? But then he goes to college. He meets these other kids, and they wind up playing Mazes and Monsters. Tom Hanks' character is like a holy man. She doesn't use any of the real shit. She she kind of does a good job of like making kind of an analogy to Dungeons and Dragons. And she did play D&D before writing the book, so she has a little bit, but it's pretty clunky. But what happens is one of the kids is super depressed, and he goes to this cavern to kill himself. And you can kind of already see like ripping off the Dallas story. It's not Tom. It's kind of like she splits that character between Robbie and this other boy, right? And so he goes, but instead of killing himself, he gets this idea of like, oh, instead of killing myself, me and my friends are going to play Mazes and Monsters in this cavern, okay? Like LARP. Which, again, you can see that ties into the Egbert case, right? So they're going basically underground to LARP out this thing, and it's all leading to danger. So they go and do this, and in the process of, like, exploring this cavern, Tom Hanks, Robbie has this, like, psychological break. Because what had happened was Robbie had an older brother. His name was Hall. And on Hall's 16th birthday, Hall was a drug addict. He had been fighting with his parents. There was a lot of turmoil in their home before, Robbie had come to college. And on Hall's 16th birthday, Hall disappeared and was never seen from again. And so Robbie, the character played by Tom Hanks, is struggling with this thing. So he has a psychotic break in the cavern and begins dreaming about this place called the Great Hall, right? Which is his brother's name. And so you can see Rona Jaff is creating like a psychodrama that's happening, not a spiritual, actual thing. She never breaches that thing. It's not there yet. It still is a dangerous world for young minds to enter into because it will damage them, right? So he has dreams about the Great Hall. He's told that he needs to go to the Two Towers. And so he winds up believing that he's his character. He takes a vow of celibacy. He starts starving himself like a monk because he's like a holy man in the game. So he stops banging his girlfriend and he stops eating. He starts living like a monk, like in the real world. Like he's now believes he's this holy man character. So he ends up disappearing, right? And they're all looking for him, and the police look for him in the caverns because they think it's a game of mazes and monsters gone wrong, just like William Deere did
This is like, because psychology was newish back then. Like, we didn't understand the mind, and anything we didn't understand, we were afraid of, and we made bad and scary. So, like, they were like, what is the mind capable of? Like, careful getting into your mind, careful with what will... if you they just didn't understand the mind, so then they create these scary stories about it. This is what we've done since human existence, is create scary stories about what we don't understand. And so psychology, so she's writing this story going, if you go into this, it's going to take over your mind because we don't understand how the mind works. It's actually good for the mind to play out in imagery and helps it heal things. But we were like, no. Right.
And it was all in this like really desperate attempt to maintain this normalcy.
Yeah.
This idea of what a person should be based on our cultural ideals and norms.
I'm sorry, but that is the single most damaging thing to a psyche, is to tell it there's some one normal something it should be, and then you don't fit in it. And you're fucked.
Which is so counter to like the way that we work. I mean, if you think about it, having a diverse society is just rationally more better than a homogenous society.
More better. You're so smart.
I am so smart. But it's better than having a homogenous society because you can tackle so much more when you have like all these viewpoints and like interests and differences.
I mean, genetics tell us that. Like,
true, right, exactly.
Like a mutt is going to have better health. A dog.
That's true.
You have like diversity of characteristics and qualities and genes.
That's true.
You're going to be healthier. You get more sameness. You're going to have like fucking deformities, mutations. You're fucked up.
Right.
So, like, we're trying to make this norm, and we are fucking ourselves up.
Right.
But you allow diversity, and we get healthier and healthier. We live longer. We have...
This is why I think we should have conservatives and progressives in government.
Exactly.
Because
like, no,
we
like,
need like
exactly.
a full
This
expression.
is why we're centrists politically, because we don't believe that one should be all the way over here or all the way over there. Everyone should be a certain way. Except here's the thing. The thing about being an extreme person in your beliefs, you can't accept the others.
No,
And
that's
so
the
it's
whole
all
thing.
The
Yeah.
labor of acceptance is on the centrists, you motherfuckers. You're making
Because
us
it's
do all
so
the fucking work.
right. If you're trapped in like an us versus them kind of mentality, you're the problem. We'll just say that. So anyway, Robbie, he's lost his grip on reality. He has this dream about the Great Hall, of course, in reference to his brother. That's pretty clearly called out in the book, obviously. And he's told to go to the two towers. So he winds up in New York City, okay? Because the World Trade Center is still there at this point. This is 1982. So he winds up in New York City, and he's wandering the streets thinking he's this holy man character
and this
from...
is the movie.
This is the movie.
Yeah.
And the book, from Mazes and Monsters, right? He ends up meeting a prostitute who... Because this kid is so weird and stuff on the street, she thinks he's just a young kid pimping himself out on the street to make a buck. So he winds up meeting a John who stumbles across his way, takes him to a room because Robbie thinks, oh, this is some guide along my journey.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go and he's going to give me some special item or whatever the fuck you do in Dungeons & Dragons, or like Mazes and Monsters in this case. But the guy starts to try to rape him, right? Because when he starts trying to have sex with him, Robbie pushes back, and so this guy like starts to try and rape him. And the book and the movie show that basically Robbie confuses him for a succubus and stabs him with a pocket knife. Now,
succubus.
This is where I have a bone to pick.
A succubus is.
What is a succubus?
I've heard this word, and I think I've even been told what it is, and I keep forgetting.
It is a sex demon, but it's a female sex demon.
Fuck you.
A male sex demon is known as an incubus.
Oh, incubus.
Incubus is a male sex demon, right? It's a demon. This is totally mythology.
Yeah.
In fact, this is Christian mythology,
I
by the
know,
way.
duh.
No, I'm saying that to them, not fucking you. This is a podcast, babe. Other people are listening. The thing is, they don't even get that right. And that's what you're going to see, especially in the next episode when we get to the religious outcry against D&D. They don't know shit. They know nothing about fucking Dungeons & Dragons. They know nothing about... Like, they start talking about how Dungeons & Dragons is teaching people demonology. They don't even know that shit. So it's just a bunch of scare tactics that happen. And so in the book, they take advantage of that kind of idea. And... he fights off this guy. He stabs him.
Thinks he's a succubus, but he's a guy. Why wouldn't he think he's an incubus?
Well, because he's a character written by a woman who didn't know what the fuck she was talking about.
Oh, so she said succubus not knowing it's a female demon?
Right. Because, people just know that word succubus. But the succubus is a woman, is a female sex demon, and an incubus is a male sex demon.
And
incubus is typically...
I would say I didn't know that either, so I don't blame her. But if you're fucking going to write a book about it, fucking know your shit.
Yeah, but again, this book was written in just a short span of time because they were trying to capitalize on Dallas's death.
I don't think I even would have known to use the word succubus, though.
Right.
I'd have been like, a demon.
Which I would argue the fact that she was trying to capitalize on this kid's death makes her a piece of shit, and she should fucking die. She's probably already dead. So anyway, so Robbie's in New York City. He stabs this John, who thinks he's a prostitute, runs away. But so what happens is back home, while he's in New York City on this quest to find the two towers to get to the Great Hall, his friends are looking for him. The police are looking for him. They trace his whereabouts back to the cavern, and they decide, oh, this is a game of Mazes and Monsters gone wrong. He's probably lost in a delusion inside. So again, they're playing on these tropes that have been put forth by the media, thanks to William Deere's crazy speculation trying to make himself a hero. And so you can see her definitely playing this out, right? So his friends figure out, because they're so smart and play the game, and the police are a bunch of bungling idiots, they figure out, oh, we know, but picking up clues and things that he's left, said and shit, they find him. And he ends up on one of the observation platforms. I think it's like the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And he's getting ready to jump. Because in this dream, like, he has magic and all this shit. And so his friends show up and they're trying to convince him, don't jump or whatever. And he's like, oh, I have spells. I can fly. It's the most hilarious fucking thing to see Tom Hanks do. So his friends find him standing on this observation deck. Like, you can just jump off the World Trade Center, first of all. Even in fucking 1982. There was no direct access. This would be a hard thing to do. No, fuck no. You couldn't just do that. And people would be jumping off the World Trade Center. People were committing suicide all the time. It's not like new.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's unrealistic. But he's like on the observation platform getting ready to jump, and his friends show up, and they're trying to convince him. And he's like still caught in his delusions, but they cleverly use the rules of the game, which they know, to convince him to come down, right? And so the end of the movie is basically them back at Robbie's parents' estate, and he's stuck in this delusion forever. That's kind of how they leave you, is that his mind is so broke. He believes he's this like holy man character, and it's a silly bunch of like, what would you call it? Just exploitation of a young boy's suicide. And so this book became a bestseller. This movie was watched by millions of people. And it solidified this idea that it didn't mention, obviously, Dallas's name. People probably didn't even think about that.
No, they didn't connect it. But when you repeat stories, and even if they don't realize they're being repeated, it's in their psyche because the news story was there. And then you have a movie, you go, oh, that resonates, or that makes sense, or it's because it's the second time I've heard it, you're like, it kind of like is an opportunity to make it really feel true the second time than the third. Right. When it's repeated more and more, you're like, you don't remember where the original seed came from, so you think, oh, this is coming from some deep intuition,
right,
and telling me this is true,
right. And we all believe, like I hear people all the same stuff say, like, I just go with my gut, or I'm just listening to my inner voice. And I'm like, sometimes that shit is fucking really wrong.
Your gut
you need to
and
be
inner
real
voice
careful.
Is all of your programming, and sometimes that's great programming, and sometimes that's fucked up.
People's guts. The reason why you don't hear certain people talk about the bad things that their gut got them into is because they're dead. So when people tell you go with your gut, you should immediately go like, I'm going to also engage my rational processes and maybe examine my gut, because my gut, while valuable, is not always right.
Yes.
And so playing to people's fears and taking these disjointed things. Dallas Egbert was a troubled young suicidal kid who also happened to have some kind of connection to Dungeons and Dragons. Mm-hmm. Those things weren't connected.
No.
But they connected the two and created this whole cultural idea, this archetype around the troubled youth who turns to Dungeons and Dragons because he's so tormented, which then takes him into this delusional fantasy world, and he winds up dying or irreparably harmed psychologically, right? That's the trope I heard, right? In church, those are the things I heard. In the culture at large, those are the things I heard, was this idea that you play Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to wind up crazy.
I don't remember hearing the details, but that it was demonic and bad. Like those, that's all I know. It was like, stay away from it. It's demonic and bad.
Right.
But then no details. But I wasn't around. I was a girl playing with Barbies, not a boy dabbling in Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And so I wasn't being warned more strongly or being talked more about it.
I would say what's interesting is the cultural programming and psychological damage that you were undergoing by playing this fantasy world about Barbie, who has this mansion and a fucking Corvette and a fucking all this shit without doing nothing for a job.
Yeah.
And dude, later she had jobs, but originally she was not. She was the trophy wife of Ken, who provided everything for her, whatever the fuck he did. And so that was the real fucking demonic shit that was going on. Seriously. Was teaching girls that you needed to be Barbie. Fuck you.
Demonic.
Demonic. Anyway, that's our cultural take on Barbie versus Dungeons and Dragons.
Barbie versus Dungeons and Dragons. Fucked me up much greater than Dungeons and Dragons.
But anyway, so the first person to really capitalize on Dallas's death was Ronna Jaffe, who wrote this book. Mm-hmm. And again, culturally in the media solidified this idea that there is some disturbing things that are going on with young men who are playing, or young people who are playing this particular game.
It was predominantly boys that they
It was in the movie. There was a girl in the group.
Oh, was it?
There were always women playing this game.
Yeah, I know.
But it was primarily a male-driven culture. But that was largely because it wasn't okay. Because of fucking Barbie, it wasn't okay for girls to be computer nerds and D&D nerds. They were looked at as boys if they weren't.
Math is hard. Remember that?
Math is hard, which was it Barbie that said that?
It was Barbie. It was a talking Barbie.
Remember that? Remember the fucking blow up over that?
And one of the things she said was, "Math is hard."
Math is hard, which it is.
It is, but making a
Barbie
Barbie
a blonde,
say it,
buxom Barbie saying it has a different connotation than like me.
Right.
So anyway, so Ronna Jaffe takes advantage with Mazes and Monsters, the book, which becomes a 1982 CBS movie of the week kind of thing. Bunch of people watch it, right? This was followed in 1984, so this is 4 years after Dallas's death, by William Deere's own exploitation of his suicide in a book he wrote called The Dungeon Master. Now, remember, in 1979, William Deere knew unequivocally, without a doubt, that D&D had fucking nothing to do with this. That this was a troubled young man. It didn't matter what hobbies he had, he was struggling. And he killed himself because of those struggles. It was psychological. It was not some media or game or any shit like that. But he writes a book called The Dungeon Master. In the book, Deere finally reveals the truth about Dallas's disappearance and subsequent suicide. He makes it clear that his death was the result of deep psychological struggles.
He does.
His abuse of some powerful drugs, and his struggling to come to terms with his sexuality.
Really?
He does. But it's all wrapped in this packaging that continues to prey upon the Dungeons and Dragons narrative. It's called The Dungeon Master. He still gives a bunch of, pages and shit to this theory, even though it's not true.
Did he say it wasn't true?
He definitely says in there that it was. He reveals that when he reveals the story basically when he went and got him in Alabama and gave him to his uncle.
So he was okay. I from what I'm hearing so far, I would take that he was capitalizing on the media frenzy about it to sell his book, which actually did tell the truth. He wasn't exploiting his nephew.
It's not his nephew. He was hired by Dallas's uncle. I disagree with you. I believe that this was an intentional attempt to take advantage of the fucking furor that he caused. He started a false thing.
I know, but
and then he capitalized that after knowing the truth. Fuck you. This guy is a fucking piece of shit.
No, listen to what I'm saying. He capitalized it to sell the book, but in the book he told the truth. So, yes, he used that to name it, to sell the book. But then in the book tells the truth. That's...
Okay, I'll let you give him credit, but fuck him. I don't give a shit about him. I think he's an asshole. He has changed his story so many times. He has told so many different tales. This guy is a megalomaniac trying to be seen as he's trying to be seen as a D&D character basically in the world. Like he's smarter, he's better, he understands these things more than everyone. It is an exploitation book. He should have released a book saying the tragic story of James Dallas Egbert and how his death had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. But he named it The Dungeon Master, and in it weaves this fascinating tale of how him going head to toe with the supposed Dungeon Master, but then this little minor thing of like, oh, it turns out it wasn't all right. So what I'm saying is he was preying upon the fears that he had a direct part in starting. He knew the truth. He let those things circulate for 4 years. And then before he set the record straight, he took advantage of those fears by writing an exploitative book, with a title and subject matter that played directly into these people's fears. They did not walk away going like, oh, we don't have to worry about Dungeons and Dragons. They did not. They still walked away with the idea that Dungeons and Dragons creates troubles.
Okay, so even though he like said the truth in the book, it was more of a downplay, and he upplayed the fear, and so because if he told the truth in the book.
Yeah, but when I say he told the truth in the book, it's not like he starts out by saying Dallas's death had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons.
That's what I'm saying.
It's couched in this like very.
The book. Okay, that's what I'm saying is, he didn't. It wasn't a book written to debunk his original theory. If you catch that in it, you're a smart person. But it also probably the way he wrote it, you could latch onto your fears rather than catch the truth he was saying, because if he downplayed it.
And I'm saying he was counting on that. In the book, Deer finally reveals the truth about Egbert's disappearance and subsequent suicide. He makes it clear that his death was the result of deep psychological struggles, his abuse of some powerful drugs, and his struggle coming to terms with his sexuality. Something that is very difficult for any young person today, let alone in 1979. In the book, Deer justifies his keeping of the truth from the public based on claims that James told him not to expose the truth because he didn't want his brother Doug to endure, quote, cruel asides from his classmates and friends and his, quote, faggot brother, quote, the dope addict. So, I found multiple places where they attribute these words to William Deer. I found places where they attribute these words to Dallas saying them to William Deer. I don't know where this source of this, who said, or if this was the exact thing said, but essentially says he kept it a secret because Dallas didn't want anyone to know, which I can believe on one hand.
Because that's what he's struggling with.
Right.
Because he knows people are calling him a faggot and a drug addict. And what he's probably most deeply concerned about is how that affects his family. Because he obviously hates himself enough to be like, who the fuck cares if I'm a faggot or a drug addict?
Right.
But if my family is connected to me, so he wants to hide it for them.
Right.
And because the world is so cruel to him, he's owning the names that they give him.
Right. And that those F-bombs we're dropping, that's just in line with what they're saying. Like we said, we have a gay son. If you call our son that, I will fucking pound you into the dirt.
It infuriates me.
We'll go so gangster on you.
I
know. No.
Infuriates me.
But here's what I find disturbing in this is William Deer was clearly hiding a secret for Dallas, according to his words. That Dallas told him the story and said, I don't want this to get out because I'm embarrassed, which is totally understandable. That means William Deer knew exactly what was going on, and he still wrote a book called The Dungeon Master, which was tied to his theory that he floated that he knew was debunked and totally wrong. Mm-hmm. Everything because he's doing all these interviews while Dallas is gone, and they don't know where he is. He's doing all these interviews, putting himself forward as this brilliant investigator who's coming on the scene, and he's going to unravel this crazy, diabolical plot by this dungeon master. So he played himself up like this. Then he finds out he's all wrong. This is just a troubled kid who disappeared and wanted to die. Yeah. And then 4 years later, knowing all of this, he writes a book that, yes, tells the truth, but it's completely wrapped up in this packaging that plays on that theory that he knows was fucking wrong.
He's convinced me he's a horrible
I'm saying William Deer is the fucking problem in this whole thing. Besides the media, William Deer could have gone on and done a media tour and said, I was wrong. Yeah. Dungeons & Dragons had nothing to do with this. Yeah. But he didn't because he could make a fuck ton of money releasing a book.
And that's all that mattered back in the 80s.
Exactly. Back in the 80s, greed is good, bitch.
Greed is fucking good.
Yeah. So, of course, in another version of this tale, told by Deer in interviews, he claims that he floated the Dungeons & Dragons angle as a ruse to trick any kidnappers that may have had James. Right. So who the fuck knows? This guy is a liar.
This is the great America people want to go back to.
Exactly. This is a fucking liar. He won't make up any story. He needs to make himself the hero. Okay? He's playing D&D in the real world. James Egbert just happened to be a nerdy kid, and nerdy kids were into D&D. That's it. So that's where it starts. That's the initial spark that gets the fervor, the cultural fear around D&D now is rolling. But it's not yet a satanic thing. Mm-hmm. One thing about the evangelical movement is they're always ready to snap up anything that bubbles up into the culture as bad. Mm-hmm. They didn't know shit about Dungeons and Dragons. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even on their radar.
Yeah.
But all you have to do is put a little blood in the water, and those motherfucking sharks will start swarming, and feeding frenzy will ensue. And so next episode, we'll look at like the true magical thinkers in this whole story. And it's not kids in their basement rolling dice to see what they're going to do next as they like take part in an intentionally and understandably or understanded, like it. They knew that this was make believe.
Right.
And then these people who think magic is real take on these characters and begin fighting against evil in the real world. And so it's this crazy story of people blaming something for what they're actually doing.
Can you imagine being those kids, watching the adults in your world go into fantasy, attacking you in their fantasy magic world about demons, when you're like, dude, I'm over here making up stories and just having fun, and you're like taking stories and like think it's fucking real. You're the fucking idiot.
Absolutely. I bet that in the 80s, you know, I remember my friends talking about my parents took my D&D or my parents burned my Dungeons and Dragons game or some ridiculous nonsense. And I bet I didn't ask them because I didn't give a shit. Who cares?
Yeah, you're like, oh, weird.
But I can imagine them like looking at their parents like, grow the fuck up.
I know. Are you fucking crazy?
Grow up.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
You think magic is real?
And this is where,
like, what is wrong with you?
This is where the disconnect and the teenagers, like, looking at their parents, watching them freak the fuck out over fantasy because the parents are believing it's reality, and the kids are looking at them like, you're fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Why would I fucking listen to you about anything?
Yeah, it's completely crazy. But this is how it all started. Everything that came after regarding Dungeons and Dragons and the Satanic Panic throughout the rest of the 80s and into the early 90s started with this tragic death of this troubled, confused boy who was clearly out of his element and needed help. And instead, people looking to make a name for themselves and sell books and make some money hijacked his suicide and allowed this to take root. And from there, as we'll see in the next episode, all kinds of crazy characters come in to add their little spin on how evil Dungeons and Dragons is.